Today on Philosophy in 10 with Professor Tom, it's the four-branch model of philosophy. Beginning students often wonder, what exactly is philosophy? Philosophers have tried to answer this question repeatedly and never entirely successfully. There is, in fact, a small cottage industry in books and articles with titles like, What is Philosophy? This includes books by Martin Heidegger, Gilles Deleuze, the psychoanalyst Felix Guattari, Jose Ortega y Gasset, plus a whole host of introductory texts with this creative name. A quick survey of these texts reveals no consensus on the proper definition. There is, however, a kind of functional, practical consensus about a definition of philosophy to be found in the course offerings of most philosophy departments. This is the four-branch model of philosophy. The four-branch model of philosophy is the view that philosophy has four main branches, one that focuses on logic and how we reason, or how we should reason more accurately, one that focuses on how we know things, one that focuses on the nature of beings and being itself, and one that focuses on the ideas of good and bad, especially when those words are used in a moral sense. However, as every philosophy student knows, short answers are no good in philosophy. As the late, great Kermit Scott used to say, usually, philosophical problems are like onions. You think you understand them at first, but then you discover that there is another layer to peel back, and another, and sometimes they make you cry. So let's take a closer look at philosophy and see where the four-branch model comes from. And at the end of this video, we will briefly consider some problems with this model. So first, let's talk about philosophy in general. If you look up the etymology of the word philosophy, and it's always good to look up etymologies, you will discover that the term has ancient Greek roots and was probably coined by Pythagoras. This is the same Pythagoras you're familiar with from your geometry classes, the Greek mathematician and philosopher who lived about 2,500 years ago. You will also discover that the word philosophy is made up of two Greek roots. It's from philo, which means loving, and sophia, which means knowledge or wisdom. So this etymology tells you that a philosopher is someone who loves wisdom. Now I have to say this is not very helpful. After all, who doesn't love wisdom? Everyone loves wisdom. Does that mean that everyone is a philosopher? I'm inclined to say yes in answer to this question, but still that doesn't really make the etymology more useful, does it? What does help here is to ask the following question. Why did Pythagoras coin this term? Well, why do we ever coin new words? Usually it's because we have something to say and we don't have the words to say it, so we come up with new words. In this case, Pythagoras thought he was doing something new, investigating the world using reason alone. I should note here that while this may not strictly speaking be true of Pythagoras himself, since he embraced reason as a tool for gaining knowledge, but also embraced a number of mystical ideas, it's at least true that there emerged an influential faction among his early followers who rejected the mystical aspects of his thought and embraced the primacy of reason as a way of gaining knowledge about the world. That is, they wanted to distinguish the new thing that they were doing, with its emphasis on human reason, from mystical religious ways of knowing and understanding the world, and thus was philosophy, the love of wisdom, born in a kind of tension with religious ways of knowing, and with which it has remained ever since. Next question. What was included in this new thing called philosophy? Well, pretty much every academic discipline: mathematics, logic, physics, chemistry, biology, psychology, all of the sciences, in fact. All of this stuff was just philosophy to those Pythagoreans who were more inclined to use human reason than understand the world in religious ways. What then was not included in their idea of philosophy? Again, any mystical ways of knowing, anything that relied on divine inspiration from the gods or the like. Interestingly, the word philosophy was used in this very inclusive, very broad sense for more than 2,000 years. That's the way that educated people understood knowledge until quite recently, in fact. All non-religious knowledge is philosophy of one sort or another. That's been the idea for basically 2,500 years. It's only in the last century or two that we've thought of mathematics and the sciences and the rest as separate from philosophy. Let me give you a quick example that illustrates this. Think for a moment about the title of Sir Isaac Newton's book on physics, published in 1697. In English, the title is The Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy. The title tells you that Newton thought of himself as a philosopher. He was a particular kind of philosopher, one doing natural philosophy, but a philosopher nonetheless. We now think of him as a physicist, and calling him a philosopher today probably just sounds odd. Now, the point of this example is that the word philosophy just isn't used in the same way anymore. It's not used in the older, broader sense, although you can still hear the occasional echo of this earlier usage. For example, the highest degree in many academic fields is still the PhD, the Doctor of Philosophy, even when the person didn't study any actual philosophy. So, what happened to philosophy in the last few centuries so that we don't use the word in its original, very broad sense anymore? What does the word philosophy now refer to, since it doesn't include stuff like mathematics or physics or the like? Well, what's left in philosophy are basically the unanswered questions that didn't go off and become their own disciplines. Over the centuries, as we learned more and more about mathematics and physics and biology and all the rest, those fields became areas for specialists, and they sort of left philosophy. Incidentally, this fact really shows how stunning has been the huge expansion in human knowledge over the last few centuries. Think for a moment about how many different fields of knowledge there are now, how many different things you can specialize in. In the beginning, there was philosophy. Now the number of fields and disciplines and subfields and sub-subfields would be difficult to count. The truth is that human beings have been remarkably successful in our quest for knowledge. In a sense, what this history shows is that philosophy has been in the business of trying to put itself out of business for 2,500 years, and it's done a pretty good job of it. So now what's left in philosophy are what seem to be very difficult questions, including questions that we're not even sure that we've asked properly. We can, however, fit these difficult questions into 4 general categories, and this is where we get the 4-branch model of philosophy. First, there are questions about logic and how we reason and how we should reason. This is the branch or subfield known as logic. Sometimes people reason well, sometimes people reason poorly, and the goal of logic as a subfield or branch of philosophy is to figure out what makes some bit of reasoning good and some bit bad, and to help us get better at it. Logic as a field was first defined by the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle, and his work on logic was so good that what he came up with was taught almost unchanged until the 20th century. There have, however, been massive developments in logic in the last century or so, and it just might be the case that logic as a subfield in philosophy is poised to separate from philosophy and become its own thing. Some of the more recently developed forms of logic are basically mathematical, for example, and don't look anything like what Aristotle came up with. You might have learned a bit about these newer forms in a college math class, in fact, truth tables and the like. Logic may in fact be migrating out of philosophy and into mathematics right now. Still, most research in logic is still done by philosophers, and it may not actually ever move completely into mathematics, since there are still so many deep philosophical problems left in logic as a field of study. So that's the first branch of philosophy, logic, the study of how we reason and how we ought to reason. The second of our 4 branches is something called epistemology. Epistemology is another word that comes to us from the ancient Greeks, and it comes from 2 Greek roots, episteme, which means knowledge, and the ology part, which means something like the science of. So epistemology is that branch of philosophy that concerns how we know things. It's the study of theories of knowledge. It turns out that there seem to be 3 main sources of human knowledge, by the way. First, we seem to gain knowledge through our senses. Philosophers call this empirical knowledge, or empiricism. Second, we seem to gain knowledge through pure reason or logic alone, like mathematics. Philosophers call this rational knowledge, or rationalism. And finally, there might also be knowledge from divine sources through revelation or some kind of mystical enlightenment or the like. Philosophers generally refer to this as mystical knowledge or mysticism, and it generally gets far less respect among philosophers than do empirical or rational forms of knowledge, by the way. This lack of respect may or may not be justified. In any case, epistemology as an area of study is unbelievably important. You'd be surprised at how much we don't understand about knowledge. Third, there is the branch of philosophy that looks at what kinds of things there are or aren't in the world and at the properties they have or don't have. This branch is generally called metaphysics. Metaphysics is, as philosophers like to say, the study of beings and being itself. If you don't find this a terribly clear description of what this branch is, you're not alone. Again, an etymology may be useful here. Let me give you a long quote from an article on metaphysics written by Peter Van Inwagen, who's the John Cardinal O'Hara Professor of Philosophy at the University of Notre Dame, and Megan Sullivan, who is the Wilsey Family College Professor of Philosophy and Director of the Notre Dame Institute of Advanced Study. Here's the quote. "The word metaphysics is notoriously hard to define. 20th century coinages like meta-language and meta-philosophy encourage the impression that metaphysics is a study that somehow goes beyond physics, a study devoted to matters that transcend the mundane concerns of Newton and Einstein and Heisenberg. This impression is mistaken. The word metaphysics is derived from a collective title of the 14 books by Aristotle that we currently think of as making up Aristotle's metaphysics. Aristotle himself did not know the word. He had 4 names for the branch of philosophy that is the subject matter of metaphysics. He called it first philosophy, first science, wisdom, and theology. At least 100 years after Aristotle's death, an editor of his works, in all probability Andronicus of Rhodes, titled those 14 books Ta Meta Ta Physica, which is Greek for the stuff after the physicals, or the ones after the physical ones, the physical ones being the books contained in what we now call Aristotle's Physics. The title was probably meant to warn students of Aristotle's philosophy that they should attempt metaphysics only after they had mastered the physical ones, the books about nature or the natural world, that is to say, about change, for change is the defining feature of the natural world. Metaphysics is thus a really pompous-sounding name that just means the books by Aristotle that came after his books about physics. Someday, some clever philosopher will come up with a better name for this branch. In any case, in metaphysics, we try to answer questions like, what are we? Do we have free will? What does it mean to exist? What kind of thing is a soul? Do souls exist? Does God exist? Do numbers exist? It doesn't get much more philosophical than that, does it? All right, finally, we come to the 4th branch. This branch is often called axiology, and it's the study of claims of value, like good or bad in both moral and non-moral aesthetic senses. This branch is thus sometimes also called value theory, although I got to tell you, philosophers use these terms and many other terms inconsistently, so just be warned. Anyway, axiology includes the study of good and bad in any ways in which those terms are used, including in art or in the philosophical study of aesthetics, in the study of moral value, the field is generally called ethics, and so on. So that's the 4-branch model. The main problem with it is that these categories all intertwine with each other, and questions in one branch tend to raise questions in the other branches. So let me close this video with a quick example to illustrate this. Imagine that you see a neighbor beating a dog. Has the neighbor done something morally wrong? Many people believe that dogs are beings with moral rights, so that beating the dog would, at least in some cases, be morally wrong. If you agree with this, then ask yourself, what is it about the dog that makes it a being with moral status, such that it has the right not to be beaten? Wait, before you try to answer that question, compare the situation with this one. You now see your neighbor beating a carpet to get the dust out of it. Is it generally morally acceptable to beat a carpet? Or do carpets, like dogs or people, have rights? Most people wouldn't consider beating a carpet to be morally wrong, at least not absent some other factors, like they're beating it right in front of your face and they know that you have severe asthma. Carpets just don't have rights. But it seems plausible to say that dogs do have rights, including the right not to be beaten. And people certainly have rights, including the right not to be beaten. So what is it about carpets and dogs and people that accounts for these differences? I don't know the answer to this question, of course, but I do know this. That question is asking about the nature of dogs and people and carpets. It's a metaphysical question and ultimately boils down to what kinds of beings have moral rights, what kinds of beings don't, and why are there these differences? This example shows that ethics, as a part of axiology, is not really separable from metaphysics. Similar problems come up in nearly every single philosophical problem. Problems in metaphysics and epistemology intersect, as do problems in metaphysics and logic, and you can say the same about logic and axiology, and so on. So one might conclude that the four-branch model of philosophy is at best a pedagogical convenience, allowing colleges and universities to offer a reasonable range of courses in philosophy, but it doesn't really reflect the internal structure of the subject matter of philosophy. So I will end this video with a challenge. Come up with a better way to define and organize philosophy, and together we will revolutionize the field.